Hello and welcome to this latest session, the Munich Putsch today, one of my favourite topics in this Germany course and one of the most important as well. Alright, so back to normal for the start of this session. First, a little quiz. So pause the screen, write your answers down, and let's see how many we get right from the last session, the rise of the Nazi Party or the early Nazi Party. You ready? Okay. So pause the screen and good luck. Okay, so the first answer, who was the first leader of the DAP? That would be Anton Drexler. DAP stands for the German Workers' Party in English, or Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. Not sure if that's how you say it. Something like that. Number 3, Hitler takes over as leader of the DAP in July 1921. The letters that he added to the party were NS, so the National Socialist. So this made the party no longer the DAP, but the NSDAP. And for short, the media termed the Nazis, and it just stuck. Number 5, who was Hitler's propaganda leader? That would be Goebbels. What number did Hitler put on his DAP membership card? 555th member, to make it look like a bigger party than it was. Remember, they actually only had 7 members when Hitler joined. Let's not forget that Hitler was sent there to spy on them by the government for their extreme right-wing views, and actually decided to like what they said and joined them. Number 7, what was the 25-point programme of the party? So this was their manifesto or their ideology, the ideas of the party, and it was made deliberately vague with lots of different points to appeal to every single German. A very clever idea, really, and it definitely worked. Number 8, what did Hitler introduce in Munich when he was reorganising his party? He introduced permanent headquarters for the NSDAP to make it a bit more slick, a bit more professional, remember. Number 9, who did Hitler try to befriend, who had a lot of influence and support of the people? All right, that was General Ludendorff. Remember, he was very popular from the war, despite the fact that he did runner, but he carried an awful lot of sway. So those people who were on the cusp, maybe not sure about this Nazi party, if Ludendorff was on board, perhaps the people would get on board as well. That was the idea. So number 10, what was set up to interrupt or beat up political opposition groups? The SA, or the brown shirts. Remember, they would go to where there were other meetings taking place, throw smoke bombs in, things like that, just disrupt other parties. And lastly, number 11, what was the one thing the party really wanted to get rid of and a common desire across Germany? Of course, that will be the Treaty of Versailles. So hopefully you got a fair few right on them. As always, the ones that you got wrong, just look them up, keep practicing, some flashcards or whatever. Just try and get them into your head. Useful facts for our evidence. Okay, so this next topic today, this session, the Munich Putsch. Brilliant story. Significant. If anything so far has been significant, then times this by 10. The Munich Putsch in November of 1923 really is the turning point in our story. Okay, so let's have a quick recap before we move on. 1923 has been a really rubbish year so far. The invasion of the Ruhr in January, because the Germans missed a payment. Then hyperinflation, of course the strikes and things before that. Then Ebert was replaced by Stresemann. We've only introduced Stresemann as a name. And then now in November, at the end of that year of chaos, the Munich Putsch. This is where Hitler takes his chance to try and take over this government and bring down the Weimar Republic. So that's what the lesson's about, what the session's about. You've got to try and understand the causes and the consequences of this Munich Putsch, remember, this rebellion. Okay, so let's get cracking on this. There's lots of activities to do, some sources at the end, and hopefully as a topic, if we get our head around the interpretations and the sources of this event, whether it was successful or not, then if we were to get a section B of paper 3 and interpretations, question 3A, B, C, D on the Munich Putsch, oh, that would be a dream. Okay, so let's get started. First thing I'd like you to do in your book, on your paper, or your corner notes, whatever you're writing on, is just draw this signpost. You don't have to necessarily draw a signpost, but as long as you've got 3 headings of short-term, medium-term, and long-term causes. Okay, once you've drawn that, unpause the video, and then I'll put some information on the board on the screen in a sec, and you'll be able to try and put them into whichever category you think they belong. Okay, so once you've drawn that, we'll move on. So these 10 causes of the Munich Putsch, or reasons why the Munich Putsch happened, they might have happened short term. So anything probably in 1923, in the year of the Munich Putsch. Medium term, I would say anything probably from 1920 to 23, something like that. And long term, anything before 1920. So hopefully that'll give you a bit of an idea. I'll put the information on the screen. You decide whether you think these are short, medium, or long-term causes. Pause the screen while you do that, and then when you're ready, we'll move on and we'll check your answers. Okay. Right, so hopefully that was okay. Let's see if you are correct. Short-term causes, so those things that happened in 1923, obviously the invasion of the Ruhr, that caused an awful lot of anger, and Ebert, who was already struggling, made a decision to go on strike, making him even less popular. Obviously, hyperinflation, people have lost lots of savings, their life has gone crazy, they can't afford food, even basic food, they've lost their savings, people on fixed-term pensions, all of those things we've talked about in hyperinflation is leading to people being angry, and the hatred of this Weimar Republic government for not dealing with the issues of 1923 well enough. So that's a really short-term cause, things that happened in the year that really triggered or pushed the Nazi Party to have this attack. Okay, so medium term, 1921 to 1922. In Italy, a fascist dictator Mussolini, he took over. A fascist is someone who, it's his way or the highway. You do what a fascist leader says. You don't challenge, you don't question. Very similar to being a dictator, really. So this might have inspired Hitler to think, well, if they did it in Italy, then we can do it in Germany. So perhaps a medium-term cause of the Munich Putsch would be that Hitler was inspired by this Mussolini character. Okay, so going a little bit further back, longer term, we've got to think about this November criminals. Remember, people are still really angry with the end of the war. They believe they were stabbed in the back, this Dolchstoß, by the politicians by signing the armistice, the Treaty of Versailles. Is still a cause of major, major anger, despite the fact that it was 5 years ago. The reparations, the 6.6 billion. The people are economically struggling, suffering. It's still a bone of contention for them, still something that makes them really, really angry. Obviously, the lost colonies in Africa and their other lost territory. All of it adds to their lack of pride and ultimately their anger. So by 1923, following this year of crisis, the Nazi Party are up to 50,000 members. This gives Hitler the idea, well, the party's massive, everyone's angry, everyone will come out and they'll support this Munich Putsch. There's no way they won't. It's a shoo-in, it's a guaranteed victory, and we're going to get rid of this Weimar Republic. So that sets us up for November 1923. Okay, for the Munich Putsch, November the 8th and November the 9th. So let's move ourselves on and we'll see the events of the Munich Putsch, start telling the story, trying to get the story into our head, and then come into a bit of an idea about whether we think it was successful or not. So the story, okay, so we just leave this on the screen. I'll talk you through bits of it, but you can see that there are bits in yellow. So I've made those yellow to stand out as key people for your Cornell notes or just your notes, however you're writing them. Key people, key facts, key dates. Okay, so they'll be in yellow, so you make a little note of that separately, but try to get our head around the whole story. As we talk through the story of the Munich Putsch, one of the tasks you're going to have to do is a storyboard, or just write a story, whichever you prefer, trying to put all of this into your own words so you get a good understanding of the story. So, here's what happens in the Munich Putsch. If you've already seen The Rise of Evil, you'll know how this is portrayed. It's portrayed really quite well, in my opinion. If you haven't, you'll have an opportunity to watch The Rise of Evil in a minute. I'll tell you where that is on the in the film and where you can see it, and maybe watch it alongside this session to give you a visual idea of the Munich Putsch. So here we are. Hitler is the head of a small party called the Nazis. We know that by now. It hates the government because of the Treaty of Versailles and the fact that the new Weimar Republic leader, this Stresemann character that we met a couple of sessions ago, he's just started paying the French reparations again. So it's a little bit of a clue of what's coming when we get onto the Stresemann lesson. Okay, so he's paying the French again, despite the fact that they invaded the Ruhr. This has really upset the Nazis and Hitler, and he just doesn't want it paid at all. So Hitler, he thinks that the German army would not stand for this, and he joins up with Ludendorff, and he explains to Ludendorff, we've got to do something about this government. They're making us a laughingstock. All right, so Hitler is not that big in Germany at this point. Neither are the Nazi Party, to be honest. They are a local party in the south of Germany, in Bavaria, that place where Munich is, in the south of Germany. And they have a prime minister of Bavaria, so it's almost like its own little country within Germany, you could say. The leader of this Bavarian government is a man called Kahr. Okay, so you see him in yellow. He's the leader, and he is right-wing, and he calls this meeting in this pub on November the 8th to try and discuss what to do and get rid of the Weimar Republic. So he's right-wing as well. The only difference is that Kahr kept this meeting away from Hitler. So Hitler doesn't actually know this is going on, although that's what Kahr thinks. Clearly, Hitler does know this is going on. So Kahr hates the government just as much, but he tries to have a secret meeting of other right-wing parties in this pub to join together and hopefully push Hitler away, because they all recognise that Hitler's a little bit more extreme than perhaps even them. So Hitler thinks that if he can get the support of Kahr and Ludendorff, he's going to be able to march on Berlin. So despite the fact this meeting wasn't necessarily something the Nazis knew about, they go to the pub in Munich, the beer hall. You might see this story as the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, and they come into the pub, and it's all a bit of a shock for Kahr. Okay, so that's the first bit of the story. Hopefully you've got a little bit of an idea in your head, some visualizations, perhaps some images or dual coding that you might be able to turn some of these words into on your storyboard or a mind map, perhaps. So the plan is to go in, to take Bavaria with Kahr and Ludendorff support, and then march on the capital of Germany in Berlin and get rid of Stresemann and the Weimar Republic. That's the plan. Okay, so let's move ourselves on to the second bit of the story, the 8th of November. So this meeting that we've talked about was taking place in this beer hall in Munich, and Hitler turns up with 600 armed Nazi SA stormtroopers, so those brown shirts. Key fact is he turns up with 600 of them. He then threatens Kahr with a gun to his head, and Kahr, obviously with a gun to his head, promises to support Hitler. Hitler makes a big speech. He said that everyone in that room, join us. Look, we've got the support of Kahr, we've got the support of this famous general Ludendorff, and the crowd, possibly with the SA and loads of weapons, or just generally, actually, were happy to support Hitler. They cheered, and as far as the story goes so far, the Nazi Party have effectively taken control of the Bavarian government. Part one, successful. The next part, obviously, is a little bit harder. They need to take this up to Berlin. So, just before the next stage of the story, it's an important critical error. Ludendorff, all right, is very powerful. So when everyone's preparing to leave the beer hall, Ludendorff lets Kahr go. In The Rise of Evil, it suggests that he lets them go and see to their wives and things like that. So Kahr, who already has agreed to support Hitler, but remember with a gun to his head, this is an issue. Okay, so Kahr has been released. So on the 9th of November, we know that Kahr doesn't like Hitler or trust him because he didn't invite him to this meeting. He goes and tells the army. Remember, so there's 100,000 soldiers in Germany still, aren't there? So Kahr alerts the army. They are still loyal to the government. They're still loyal to Stresemann. So this is where the Munich Putsch begins to start unraveling and starts to fail. So the next day, after the night in the pub, on the 9th of November, 3,000 Nazis, so just normal people who are in the Nazi Party. Remember, there's 50,000 members of the Nazi Party. 3,000 of them, including Ludendorff, Goering, Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA, and Streicher, they march into the centre of Munich. They take over this government as planned, and it's paid for by robbing two banks on the way. So they literally just go into two banks and they rob them, owned by Jews. The police and the army were, of course, waiting for them since they'd been informed in an ambush attack, which is very clearly seen in The Rise of Evil. So Hitler's thoughts that the townspeople would support him were crushed. He really thought the people of Munich would come out and support him, particularly after this hell of a year of 1923, but they just didn't. I think they're probably just fed up of all the chaos that's been going on since World War I. So the whole thing is a bit of a joke, really, a bit of a farce, and it's over within minutes. 16 Nazis are killed, as well as 3 police officers. So 16 Nazis are killed. Hitler is injured. but he does manage to escape. It's suggested that he dislocated his shoulder as he fell over, and you can see in The Rise of Evil, as they approach the army, Hitler marches forward and they shoot. But Hitler falls down and dislocates his shoulder, and then a couple of days later is found hiding in a wardrobe. He is, of course, arrested, and that's the end of the Munich Putsch. So probably even less effective than the Spartacist uprising or the Cat Putsch that we've already looked at in recent sessions. I wonder what your thoughts on this so far are. Maybe you could just pause this lesson here and have a little think. Was it a disaster? Was it more successful than the Spartacist or Cat Putsch? Does it make the Nazi Party look stupid or pathetic? Over within minutes, 16 dead Nazis. The whole thing is a bit of a farce, and Hitler is arrested, found in a wardrobe. Okay, so that's the story. So before we do move on, like I said before, it would be useful at this stage to try and consolidate our knowledge of the story and turn this into some sort of dual coding, so some images or a storyboard. So let's visualize what we can see and what we've just read. So this painting shows us this scene where the army meet these 3,000 Nazis marching through the streets of Munich. Hitler standing there in the middle. All right, we can see Goering there as well, and Ludendorff next to Hitler on his left-hand side. Hitler's hands up. He's central to the painting. We'll talk about this shortly because it's going to be one of the sources we look at. But generally speaking, this is the scene that's been painted, and this is where Hitler dislocates his shoulder when the army fire on this crowd of people. We can see some people in the front have been shot and they're dead. That would indicate the 16 Nazis that were killed. So Hitler's been dragged off. Goering was shot in the thigh, and the Munich Putsch is over. This painting, believe it or not, is a Nazi painting, but we'll discuss that as a source analysis at the end of this session. All right, so the storyboard that we need to think about will be enhanced by you watching The Rise of Evil. So it's on 55 minutes if you choose to use the link on stchistory.com. So if you just go to stchistory.com and then click the third link at the top, GCSE videos, this will take you through to this page, and then click on Germany, and The Rise of Evil is the top link in there. Okay, so this will give you the whole film. If you've got it on DVD, it's 55 minutes into episode 1, and then just watch for the next 15 minutes or so. This will give you some background, some discussions. It will basically visualize what we've just talked about so far in this session, the story of the Munich Putsch. So that would be really useful to do that straight away. So pause this screen and then open up the link to The Rise of Evil and then come back to this video. Okay, and then hopefully we've got a real good idea of the story, at least for now. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that Rise of Evil clip if you've just watched it. If you haven't watched it already, the whole thing, once again, it is absolutely phenomenal as a resource. So here's a storyboard that I've designed that you might want to use. So obviously the bigger the box, you put your dual coding, your pictures or your images in there, and the smaller boxes, they would be your captions or the summary of the story of what's going on. So you'll be able to download this as a PowerPoint from the Germany section of stchistory.com. It'll be just next to this lesson in the link. Just click download it as a PowerPoint or a PDF, and you can print it and then draw on your storyboard if you want, or edit it actually in PowerPoint, or however you want to present it, just as an exercise of trying to get this knowledge secure of the actual story. Once we know the story really well, then we can start building onto it for source analysis and the interpretations. Okay, so that's a nice task for you to do. You don't necessarily have to do it right now. You can maybe go back to this session later, or after the session you might want to do it then to see if you can consolidate this knowledge. Okay, so that's the storyboard. Let us have a little think then of the aftermath of the Munich Putsch. So we got to think to ourselves why this thing failed. Okay, and it's quite a difficult question, this one. Why did it fail? Because there's not an awful lot really that we can pinpoint as specifics. There's a lot of little things that generally tended to happen, but we'll try and put them all together and consider this perhaps might look like a 12 marker. Explain why the Munich Putsch failed. I think it'd be a difficult question, but it's certainly one that they could ask us. So we need to think of 3 really strong reasons why the Munich Putsch failed. And like I say, there's lots of little reasons, but it's not quite 3 big reasons. So let's see if we can maybe merge some of the ideas together. So the first thing to think about is how badly planned it was. They sort of had this crazy idea that they'd simply march into the pub, take Bavaria, and then go to Munich. They did attempt to cut the phone lines and things like that, but the planning was pretty bad, and we'll see in a sec. One of the main things that they didn't do in their planning was they did not surround the army barracks in Munich, which obviously means it's very easy for the army to get out and go and meet them in the streets of Munich. So planning wasn't great. All right, like we said, they didn't surround the army barracks. There's 50,000 Nazis. There's the SA. They should have surrounded the army barracks. That meant that that would mean the army wouldn't have been able to get out, and there would have been nothing stopping the Nazis marching through Berlin. Marching up to Berlin via Munich. So actually, what happened was the army got out, and it was over in minutes. I think Ludendorff letting cargo was a really significant reason why the Munich Putsch did fail, because he is the one who alerted the authorities, the police and the army. So that's a big reason why this putsch failed. Also, the fact that the Nazis thought that the people would support them. They were convinced that the people of Munich would come out and they would support the Nazis, and it would be easy, because they're all so angry after 1923. They're all still angry about the Dolchstoss, about November criminals, about the Versailles, everything. But they didn't. The people didn't, and this was a massive error of judgment from the Nazis. Okay, obviously the lack of support from Kahr. He is the leader of the Bavarian government, so without his support, it really wasn't ever going to work. And we know that because that was the first part of the Munich Putsch plan, was to get Kahr on board. And he did, obviously, only by holding a gun to his head. So not having Kahr's support is definitely an important reason why this did not work out. All right, there was a severe communication breakdown from all the way from Hitler down to the SA, down to the people in the streets. It just was a complete communication breakdown. Didn't work. So when things started to unravel and go wrong, it's very difficult to get messages back and forth. The SA were already on their way out. People were already marching through the streets. And then obviously the army met them through the streets of Munich. So all of these things combined, really, we need to be able to understand that they all played their part and be able to explain why these things on the screen helped the Munich Putsch or can contribute to the Munich Putsch failing. Whether or not we can get this into 3 specific reasons, we can maybe toy along with that as we get close to the end of your course. But generally speaking, those ideas here are why the Munich Putsch failed. Okay, we've seen the painting of the police blocking them and shooting at them. So 16 Nazis, remember, killed in minutes, and 3 police officers. Okay, so how has Hitler used the Munich Putsch to his advantage? Because straight away, first things first, at this point of our session, well, it's a complete disaster, isn't it? It's a complete embarrassment. Over in minutes, they look stupid. They haven't been able to organize things. They use force through the SA. It really, really is a disaster. The Nazi Party should be finished now. So obviously we know from the story that that's not the end of the Nazi Party. And as we go through the next couple of sessions, you'll see just how this Nazi Party recover from this absolute disaster of the Munich Putsch. So how has Hitler used his trial? So obviously he was arrested, hiding in this wardrobe, and he gets put on trial. Now, in theory, Hitler should be sentenced to death. He should get the death sentence because this is treason. He has gone against his country. He's tried to take over the country, and anybody else would be done for treason and probably executed. Not Hitler. So Hitler finds himself in the courtroom. You'll see this on The Rise of Evil as well. Very well. It shows it really well and really clearly. So he uses this court case to grow his fame. So the journalists are in there. They're watching the court case every day, reporting and writing about this Hitler guy. Now remember, he started off relatively unknown. He's known in Munich, but not really anywhere else in Germany. After this trial, well, everybody knows Hitler. He's famous. Everybody knows him. As we've seen already throughout this whole Germany course so far, the judge is right-wing, as always. So he actually supports what Hitler's saying, and he allows Hitler to stand there and deliver these big speeches about the Weimar Republic, about the Treaty of Versailles, about all of the things that people are angry about. The judge gives Hitler a platform. Now remember, this is Hitler on trial. He shouldn't really be given this platform to deliver these speeches, But also remember from the last session that Hitler is really good at speaking. He's really good at persuading people to come to his way of thinking. He's got that way of getting the crowd in the palm of his hand, and he does it. He does one of his master sessions and one of his master speeches in this courtroom on this trial. And the myth of Hitler, the stories, they fly around Germany, and by the end of the trial, he is famous nationally and even internationally in other countries. The Nazi Party are now known. Yes, the vast majority of Germany and the world think, what a bunch of crazy psychos, extremists trying to take over the country. Who do they think they are? Nutters. Okay, so that is how he uses the trial to his advantage. It's really, really clever. However, he has gone against the country, so the reality is there does have to be some consequences, doesn't there? So let's have a little look. Now, in your book, on your paper or your notes, you might want to present something like this. So I've put some scales on the screen to decide whether you think the Munich Putsch was a success or failure. I would imagine if it was a real scales, the side with most examples would be where you think you sort of lie on this. It's important as we think about the interpretation side, because you could be getting some interpretations in your exam that suggest the Munich Putsch was a success. And you might have to compare that to somebody's interpretation that it was a complete failure. So your job really is to put everything we've done so far in this session, all of your notes and all of your ideas, into one of these scales. So a failure, you might put 16 Nazis killed in minutes, Nazi party embarrassed, Hitler arrested, something like that. In the successes, if you can think of any so far, I suppose you could put in there that it makes the Nazi party famous. However you want to do it, just try and get yourself in a situation where you're building up two different interpretations of this Munich Putsch. So more information will come on the next screen, and you'll be able to add that into success or failure just to help you out a little bit more. Okay, so the consequences, whether we think short or long term. Hopefully you've drawn your scales by now, and we can start adding some of these things in. So consequences, remember, are things that happen because of the Munich Putsch. So here's a photograph of Hitler having been arrested at his trial and so forth. So short term, they are put on trial. So was that a success or a negative? Okay, so you might argue, well, it's a complete negative. He's been arrested, he's on trial, he's in court. That's bad. Or you might argue that it's a positive because he used the court case, the trial, to get his message out there. The NSDAP were humiliated, and they really were. Lots of people thought, what a bunch of extremists, nutters. So they were absolutely in the short term. So short term, remember being near the time, they were humiliated. Ludendorff was found not guilty of his part in this. Now, make of that what you want, but remember, he is a beloved army general. But the judge found Ludendorff not guilty of any part of the Munich Putsch. Hitler was found guilty of treason, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. So this is short term, remember. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now remember, the punishment for treason normally would be execution. He gets 5 years in prison. That's not too bad, is it, when you think about what he's done? So obviously the judge really has leaned quite favourably on Hitler. All right, so the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, they're banned until 1927. So they can't meet, they can't have rallies or their newspapers, or all of it. The Nazi Party are effectively gone until 1927. All right, so again, a fairly lenient punishment, you might say. Or you might say, actually, that's enough. They're not going to come back. And anytime they do come back, everyone remember what they did in 1923. Hitler was banned from all public speaking as well until 1927. I mean, he's in jail. All right, so he's in jail for 5 years. Can't really do much from there, can he? But he's still banned. That seems a bit silly to ban him from public speaking when he's actually in jail. Okay, so there are some examples of the short-term consequences of the Munich Putsch. Longer term, so this is where you might start seeing, actually, this worked out pretty well in the end. Yes, they failed short term. Yes, they were embarrassed. Yes, they were humiliated. Over a minute, 16 Nazis killed, all that. Yeah, disaster. But long term, let's have a little look at long term. He used this trial to become nationally known. He's been able to give his opinion and get his speeches out there criticizing and attacking the Weimar Republic. He is now famous, and lots of people agree wholeheartedly with what he says. So he's actually got more support in the long term following the Munich Putsch. And the long term can be anything up to 3-4 years, or maybe up to 1933 when he takes power. Okay, he realized that taking power would never work. He knows that he can't ever attempt to take power through force like he's just attempted in Munich Putsch. So he changes his whole philosophy. He changes his mind. He changes his tactics. He now knows that in order to become the leader of this Germany and get rid of this Weimar Republic, he's going to have to do it from the inside. So he's going to have to be elected, not take it by guns. And this term we use for this bit of the story is ballot, not bullet. Now, the ballot box, as hopefully you know, if you don't know, the ballot box is where you put your vote in a general election. So you pick your person who you want to be the leader, and you put it inside a ballot box, and then it's counted, and the winner is the one who gets the most votes. So we're going to have to go through the ballot box. In other words, he's going to have to be elected, not by using the bullet. So ballot, not bullet. It's a really useful term to hopefully help you remember the long-term consequences of the Munich Putsch. Okay, in prison, whilst he's there, he writes his famous book. Now, hopefully you might have heard of his book, Mein Kampf. That means my struggle. He writes this while he's in prison. He's got all the time in the world. He's there for 5 years, remember? Or that's what he's sentenced to. And he writes this book. Now, I've read it. It's a complete rant. He's obsessed with STDs and syphilis and Jews, and it's just a rant. It's not a well-written book at all, but what it does do is it sets out the blueprint, if you like, or the ideas of what he wants his Germany to look like. And there's lots of clues in there about what's going to come. And obviously with the Holocaust and all of the things that the Nazis do when they do take power, well, you can trace it all back to this Mein Kampf book. And perhaps you could argue as the long-term success of the Munich Putsch was, had he not been arrested and given the time to write this book, perhaps he wouldn't have been so able to seamlessly, it seems, take control of Germany when the moment presented itself after the Wall Street crash in 1929, which obviously is all coming later on. So maybe just the opportunity in prison to write this book and formulate his ideas. All right. But the Mein Kampf for us is the inspiration of everything that comes going forward, and he's been able to formulate his ideas whilst he's been in prison. All right. The ban on the NSDAP was lifted in February 1925, so they haven't really been banned at all. Maybe 18 months, just over 18 months, and now they're back. But that still doesn't really give us Hitler, because he's in prison, isn't he? Well, actually, no. So he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he actually only had to serve 9 months. So it really does make a bit of a mockery of the system, doesn't it? When this guy has committed treason, was only sentenced to 5 years, and then he only served 9 months, and then he's out. And that's a whole new session in a couple of sessions' time. Once we get through Stresemann's golden years, we'll have a little look at the reorganization of the new Nazi party following the Munich Putsch. But yeah, 9 months is all that he served. Okay, so having hopefully watched The Rise of Evil and seen this scene and how it's presented in that, as well as all of the knowledge of the story, let's look at this as a source. So source D, let's see if you can maybe make some annotations or notes on your paper about what this thing shows us. So pause the screen, write down a few ideas, maybe try and answer the questions that you can see on the board, on the screen, and then we'll have a little bit of feedback. All right, so the impression this source gives you about Hitler's part in the Munich Putsch. I would say the quite obvious thing is that he's quite important because he's in the center of the painting, but he's at the front of the masses of people, the 3,000 Nazis there. His hand is up. He looks very aggressive. He's definitely playing a part in this, and he's not afraid, is he? He's not afraid of the army facing him with guns. So Hitler's role in this, he's quite dominant, he's quite powerful. All right. How is it different from what you know now? Does it support what we know? It doesn't really give us too many specific facts and figures like 16 Nazis, but it does show us some dead Nazis, doesn't it? I don't know. You work out yourself if you think this supports your knowledge, what you know. Does it back it up? Is this what you'd expect to see? It says that Hitler is standing in front of the rebels with his arm raised, like we've said, with Ludendorff to his right. And obviously we can see Goering in there as well. It's a really positive, I think, image. It suggests there's loads of people behind Hitler supporting him. And actually it's a bit of a success. This should go against what we've just been talking about. It was, in the short term, a complete disaster. So let's do this a few more times with a few sources. As always, just make a few notes for each source. That the more we practice these things, the easier they'll be when it comes to writing them in the exam. So we're going to try and use the COP model, or you can still do NOPCAT if you want, whichever works best for you. So content, what does the source tell us? Some own knowledge that supports what the source tells us, and then the provenance, okay? So that's NOP if we were doing NOPCAT, nature, origin, and purpose. So pause the screen, make some little annotations on source A. Unpause and we'll have a quick discussion of these sources. We won't spend too long on them. Just to get you thinking and get you practicing all the time, we need to be getting some content out of it. So a quote, we need to be getting some own knowledge to back up what we're reading, and we need to consider the provenance of the source. All these things considered, we then need to start thinking about how useful are these sources. In this case, let's use an example of how useful are these sources for an inquiry into the Munich Putsch. Okay, so give yourself a couple of minutes to make some notes and observations, and then we'll unpause and feedback. Okay, so the first thing that we'll see, we'll do the provenance first. Okay, so from a report in September of 1923. So the nature of source A, is it an official report from the Bavarian police? That should immediately make you think, well, it's got to be fairly useful. It's an official source. September 1923. Okay, that's the origin of the source. And that should immediately start ringing some alarm bells to you, thinking, well, actually, the Munich Putsch was in November 1923. So you're starting to think already, just by taking that time to look at the provenance, that this source may well have a different slant, and it may not be very useful at all. So let's have a little look at some of the content. It says, as a result of rising prices and unemployment, the workers are bitter. The patriotic are at fever pitch, and because of the failure of the resistance in the Ruhr. So this source is really useful for us if it said an inquiry into the causes of the Munich Putsch. So if it was the causes of the Munich Putsch, we can pick out the unemployment and rising prices and the workers being angry. That's why the Munich Putsch happened. So this content, we'd pick out the quote. We put it in quote marks, we'd quote from the source. We then put in some own knowledge. Now we know why they were unhappy and unemployed and bitter, because of hyperinflation. We know that. So we bring in some own knowledge about that. Perhaps those people who lost their savings, pensioners, all of the things that we've looked at already in the last session, you can start bringing in to this source analysis and how this source might be useful, looking at the causes of the Munich Putsch. But the second half of the source, even though it's a small source, gives us another really clear and good topic to discuss. The patriotic are at fever pitch, it says. Those people who are really proud to be German, fever pitch, they're at a frenzy, all right? They're so upset with how 1923 has gone. But this suggests a second reason why they're angry, and that is because of the farce in the Ruhr, okay? So the fact that Ebert told them to go on strike, I guess these nationalists, these right-wing extremists, I think they were expecting or hoping that they would fight the French, and you know, defend our country and have some pride. So just this small source, we get this really good idea about some of the causes of the Munich Putsch. So the economic causes and the failure of their pride, really, the loss of pride in how Ebert dealt with the invasion of the Ruhr. So hopefully you picked out some of those things. So let's do this again for source B. Okay, again, similar thing. Pause the screen, make some notes. Obviously, there's a few more words this time, but that is more helpful actually because it gives us more to be able to pick out. Even if we are having a bit of a mental break of knowledge, when we read the source, hopefully that'll trigger some of the things that we know in our minds. So pause the screen, and then when you're ready, come back and we'll see what we can pick out from this. All right, so we'll start with provenance again, just see what we've got. So an announcement, that's the nature of the source. It's an announcement. It's being said. And it's being said by car. So we know that Kahr is the leader of the Bavarian government. We know he's right wing, and we know he's called this meeting that doesn't involve Hitler or the Nazis. The origin of the source is the 9th of November, 1923. So that's the second day of the Munich Putsch. And its purpose will work out as we read through it. So Kahr, and he's there, remember, so that's probably why this makes it a bit more useful. He is there. He's going through the whole Munich Putsch. He's had a gun at his head. So what he says right now probably is what happened, certainly through his eyes, but you can add your own knowledge to make sure you see. So he says, the deception and treachery of ambitious rebels have changed a peaceful meeting, held to encourage people to work together, into a scene of disgusting violence. The declarations of support forced from myself, General von Lossow and Colonel Seisser, at the point of the gun are null and void. The National Socialist German Workers' Party and the troops who have gathered to support them are banned. Okay, so this is quite a powerful announcement. It's after the Munich Putsch, and Kahr has said, basically, we supported him, but we were forced to. So there's loads of stuff in there, and hopefully as we read that source, or you've listened and read it yourself, it's supporting what we know has happened in this Munich Putsch. So some content to pick out is that he was forced, and was General von Lossow and Colonel Seisser, they were forced to support this disgusting violence. So you would then hopefully put some own knowledge in there about the gun and how he arrived on the 8th of November at night, and no one knew he was coming. It was all a bit extreme, but that's what helped take over. You also know that the consequences of it were the Nazi Party were embarrassed, humiliated, 16 Nazis were killed, all of that stuff. That would be your own knowledge to support what happened. And you also know that Kahr doesn't like Hitler. So that would explain the quotes or the content. The deception and treachery of ambitious rebels has changed a peaceful meeting. So basically what he's saying is these guys just turned up. So another nice source, there's probably other things we can pick out, but just to try and, I just want you getting in the habit of picking out bits of sources that we can hopefully use for technique-wise, remember the quotes added to own knowledge, and then saying how and why this makes this source useful for an inquiry into the Munich Putsch. So this source would be more of an aftermath. So maybe how useful is this source for an inquiry into the aftermath of the Munich Putsch, or what happened after it. But just for this instance, hopefully you picked out some of those things, and perhaps more importantly, you've got lots of own knowledge that would support what Kahr has said in this announcement. The fact that it's an announcement by him, remember, we know that as our provenance check makes this source very useful straight away because Kahr was there. All right, so a couple more to do, and then we'll finish this session. But it's just good practice to get into the habit of, and remember that the source useful question is the same for the trenches part of paper 1. Okay, so 2 sources, we're being asked how useful these 2 sources are for an inquiry into a specific topic. So source C, a photograph this time. Again, write some notes, some ideas, pause for a couple of minutes, and then when you're ready to come back and we'll move on. All right, so source C, a photograph of Hitler's shock troop in Munich on the morning of the Putsch on the 8th of November 1923. So photograph, provenance. It's a snapshot in time. It shows us what was happening. It's Hitler's troops. We can see that they are in their uniforms, so the SA, the brown shirts, and we know it's on the 8th of November 1923, so the origin is the day of the Munich Putsch. All right, so hopefully you picked out those really obvious things, but it shows us, doesn't it, that they've got their flag, they've got their vehicle, and they are going through Munich to take over Munich and take over this Bavarian government. So it shows us what we would expect to see based on our own knowledge of what happened on this day. Some extra own knowledge, remember that there were 600 SA men who burst into the beer hall, into the pub, interrupting the meeting, and then on the next day we've got the 3,000 Nazis. So this source, other than source A, which was obviously talking about the causes, source B was clearly talking about the aftermath. This source definitely seems to be talking about during the event itself. So hopefully, again, you've managed to pick out some things from there. Now, a lot of people think when they see a picture source, so that's great, it's much easier, but I don't know. I think sometimes written sources are a little bit easier because they give you something to pick out and quotes, whereas you have to really work out what's going on in a picture. But still, a quote, obviously you can't quote a picture, but you can say source C clearly shows. That's just the same as source B clearly says. All right, so let's have a look at source D, same again. So it's our painting that we've already seen. We've already talked about it, so we maybe don't need to spend so long on this one. It's a Nazi source in 1940, so Hitler is well and truly in power. World War II has started, and this painting has been made. Possibly, if we're thinking about a purpose in this, in the provenance, is to try and raise everyone's confidence in Hitler and remind everyone how brave he is, how wonderful he is, and look, when he faced the army head on and he's still here going strong today, basically get behind Hitler in this Second World War. So that possibly be the purpose of it. It's a painting, so it's always going to be somebody's interpretation of the events, and it's portrayed Hitler, again, this hero in the middle, standing firm, hand up, ready to fight, despite the fact there's an army with guns meters away from you. So that's part of the provenance. Then content, we can see, we've already talked about, it shows this band of Nazis in the streets of Munich. Match that to your own knowledge. Do we know that happened? Yes, we do. 3,000 Nazis marching through the streets of Munich. And the content speaks for itself. We can see the army. A bit of our knowledge, you'd add the 16 Nazis, 3 police officers, and the whole thing being over in minutes. Stuff like that. Okay? So hopefully you've been able to annotate this source quite well now, because we've looked at it a couple of times in this session. All right, so source G, and this gets a little bit interesting now because it's a letter written by Hitler himself. So it's in 1924, so it's a year after or so. So remember, he's in prison and he's serving his 5-year sentence. That's actually only 9 months. So pause, annotate, make some notes on this source, and then let's see what we can pull out of it. Okay, so provenance, the nature of this source, it's a letter. All right, its origin is written by Hitler in 1924 while he's in prison. So this is automatically going to be a pretty useful source because it's coming from Hitler himself. You may not agree with what he's saying, but what it does do is it tells us and it shows us that actually he is what he's thinking and feeling. So he says in this source, when I resume active work, it will be necessary to pursue a new policy. Instead of working to achieve power by an armed coup, we will have to hold our noses and enter the Reichstag. If outvoting them takes longer than outshooting them, at least the result will be guaranteed by their own constitution. Sooner or later, we shall have a majority, and after that, we'll have Germany. Okay, so he's done a bit of a rant in this letter, but it certainly shows us what we know. Remember that term, ballot, not bullet. This letter clearly shows that Hitler has decided after the failure of the Munich Putsch, he needs to change his tactics. He's saying it himself. He's not happy about it. The way he talks about the Reichstag, we have to hold our noses when we go in. And outvoting them take longer than outshooting them, then so be it. He's still saying the same thing will happen, we'll get rid of them. So this is really important because in 1924, this source gives us a real turning point into the Nazis' tactics and how they think that they're going to get into power. It should match your own knowledge, particularly the ballot, not bullet. He's realised following the failure of the Munich Putsch that he cannot just take power because he tried it and he failed. He talks about the armed coup there. That was the Munich Putsch. So the content is really easy to match up to your own knowledge of the Munich Putsch. So a source like this would give us plenty to say. All right, so this might well be a useful source, particularly for the consequences of the Munich Putsch. But still, even if it's just about the Munich Putsch generally, it gives us a real good insight that the Munich Putsch changed the Nazi Party's tactics. And Hitler has been clever enough to realise that. All right, so he's written this letter while he's in prison. A really useful source, actually, not just because it's by Hitler, but it certainly does tell us that the Nazi Party have realised they do need to change their tack a little bit, because attempting an armed coup like that again, probably, even though the judges are probably a little bit right-wing, he may not get away with it a second time. All right, so that's what he's realised. Source E, this is difficult, this one. So maybe take a little bit longer before you come back to this one. It's a cartoon, so it's been designed to show something. Normally cartoons are critical or designed to mock, particularly when it's political. So have a little look at the provenance and then see what you get. All right, so this source actually is quite difficult. Let's see what we can work out. The provenance of the source is 1924, so the origin. It's a cartoon from a political magazine, and it's showing us that Hitler is setting fire to the town. He is being carried by von Lasso, the head of the German army in Bavaria, and von Kahr, the leader of the state government in Bavaria. Meanwhile, Kahr shouts out, "Officer, arrest that arsonist up there." Okay, so that's a little bit of information that it gives us, and hopefully that triggers to you the story of the Munich Putsch. So Hitler is going through the streets setting fire. This is what this cartoon suggests. I'm not necessarily sure that that's what happened, but it's a destructive attack, isn't it? That's what's going on. Hitler is being held up by von Lasso and Kahr. Remember, as we've just seen in one of the earlier sources, they believe, or Kahr believes, they were forced to support this destruction. That's your own knowledge, and that explains why in this source, despite the fact Kahr is carrying Hitler, he's also shouting to the police, "Arrest him up there." So he's saying, "Come and get him," and that hopefully matches your own knowledge that Kahr went and informed the authorities. So you know that he went and told the police and the army about this armed coup or this attack from the Nazi party. So this source really does show us that. We can see it at night because it's dark with the stars. That star at the top is a swastika, so giving us the impression that it's a Nazi source. It just looks a bit like chaos, really, and destructive and damage being caused by Hitler on this night. So some content really lovely. The source gives us good information at the top in the provenance, really, but we can sort of see whether we think this is useful or not. Even though it's a cartoon, it represents, doesn't it, what we know happened on this night. And the content is very clear, what it's showing, and your own knowledge. So again, on source E, I really do think that we could get an awful lot out of that in describing and suggesting why this source might be useful for the Munich Putsch. Now this, again, might be a source related to the events of the Munich Putsch rather than the causes or the aftermath or consequences. So I like this source. It's a bit harder at first glance, but once you break it down and you start putting into it its own knowledge and what it shows us, then actually it's quite a nice source to look at. So officially then, how this might look in an exam. So I'm going to let you do an actual how useful question. So this will take you maybe 20 minutes or so. The question is, how useful are sources C and D for an inquiry into the importance of the Munich Putsch for the Nazis? So there's a very specific focus to this question. It's an inquiry into how important the Munich Putsch was for the Nazis. All right. Now remember, when we do these source usefulness questions, we've got to be positive. We don't want to immediately jump into this source is not useful because it's only one, it's only by this person, and it was too late, it was after the time. We've really got to make sure that we are positive and we try and find things that make the source useful. So content, what does the source say? We know because it says, so we quote. We use our own knowledge to back up those quotes and then look at the provenance. Who made it, when was it made, what is the source, and why does that make it useful? So this is a mark scheme, just to give you a bit of an idea or a recap on what you need to do for the exam, with some hints and tips at the bottom. So you can pause the screen, have a little read of them, maybe make some notes of the two or three bullet points that you want to focus on this source question, and then I'll put the two sources on the next screen, pause the screen there, read the sources, annotate them just like we've done for the last 4 or 5 sources. Pick out the things that you want to say and then attempt to write this answer. Remember, on our YouTube channel, there is a how to answer this source utility question as well. If you've forgotten how to do it, it's effectively just 2 big paragraphs, source C first, then source D, how they are useful for an inquiry into the importance of the Munich Putsch. You've got to keep coming back to the idea of how these sources were useful to a historian trying to figure out how important was it. Was the Munich Putsch important at all? It was. It definitely was important to change their political tactics, but it also got them famous and managed to get their message across better than perhaps if they were successful. So you have a little think about all those things in this session, some knowledge as well. Pause the screen and then write your answer. And then as you go forward, so try not to let the video go on too far, because there'll be a pretty good answer giving you an idea of what you could have said. But try and have a go first before you actually look at the answer. Okay, so pause it here on the sources. The bits in red are in the provenance. Remember, that's the NOP, N-O-P, nature, origin, purpose, and then the actual sources themselves. Okay, so good luck with this. Have a good go at it. Use your notes if you need to, if you're really struggling for some content and some own knowledge, but just try to make sure you've got some good examples, some good quotes from each source, and some good examples of own knowledge that back it up, and then say how these things are useful. All right, so just for example, to get you started, source C, Hitler is talking to this Kurt Ludek character in 1924. He's a former Nazi supporter, and he breaks away with Hitler in 1934 and becomes a critic. So immediately you might get a little bit negative. You say, oh, Ludek's bound to say this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. He's decided he's turned against Hitler. But don't allow that to happen. Think about it more objectively, that Hitler is talking to Kurt Ludek. So what this source says is a conversation between two people who are there around the time. Okay, so although it maybe is written long after, you can then consider how that affects its usefulness, but don't decide that it's a complete disaster just because it was written so long after the event. Okay, so pause the screen with the sources on, and then begin writing your answer in your book, on paper, or on your computer. Obviously, anything that you do right get marked as well by your teacher. Okay, and then we'll have a look at a reasonably good answer. Not necessarily perfect, but a good answer. Okay, so hopefully that was pretty useful, just to stop and try and put all of this together. Maybe it'd be good to use your storyboard, or do the storyboard now if you haven't already. Pretty close to actually doing the topic. It's a useful topic, it's an important topic. I think it's a straightforward topic as well. So the sooner we can get this Munich Putsch into our heads, definitely the better. Okay, so let's see this good answer. So we can see, we'll start with source C first. It says source C is useful because it shows Hitler recognized the Munich Putsch was important. It demonstrated to him that the Nazis could not come to power through an armed coup, but that they would instead have to achieve power by being elected. The source is useful for showing us that Hitler had believed the Munich Putsch was a good way to come to power, because he wouldn't have done it otherwise, but after he realised that he would be in a more secure position if he was voted in, even if this was a slower option. So we know that. We know that he was happy to wait if it took longer, because we've learned that in this session, haven't we? Furthermore, source C was said by Hitler to his close friend and supporter Kurt Ludek at the time. As Ludek was trusted, we can suggest that the source is useful, as this is Hitler's accurate opinion. Our own knowledge shows us that. We know that he went for the ballot not bullet approach. Hitler in the source does not acknowledge that the Munich Putsch was a disaster, even though it took only 100 policemen 3 minutes to stop the Nazis. Okay, so in this source it suggests it was a great success, and he's pushed them to needing to change his ways, but it doesn't actually talk about the disaster that it was. So there's a good opportunity for some own knowledge in there. 3,000, 100 policemen, 16 dead Nazis, which we'll see in a sec. Hitler instead claims that the Munich Putsch was a success for revealing to him a better way to take power. This is limited in its usefulness because it does not reflect that the putsch was a disaster that led to 16 Nazis being killed and him being put on trial for treason. So although we're trying to be positive, we can obviously still always say that how a source is a little bit less useful, but it's important to not go on a rant about how a source is not useful. So in this case, we've got a small statement there, but this is limited in usefulness because it does not reflect that the putsch was actually a short-term disaster. The purpose of the source is to reassure other Nazis that Hitler knows how to lead the party after they fail to achieve their goal. So don't lose faith in Hitler, all right? Believe in him, all right? It didn't go to plan, but he's such a good leader, he's realised, he's learned from this mistake. This affects its usefulness as Hitler has to ensure he appears to be an able leader. He is not going to admit that it is his own idea to seize power that led to the party being banned. So again, in what the source is saying, we can work out actually the purpose of why it was made is to try and keep Hitler looking strong. All right, so that's source C. Then we do the same, a little analysis for source D. So source D is useful for showing that even if the putsch was a disaster, Hitler actually turned the trial to his benefit. Through being accused of treason in a public court, people began to listen to him and study his ideas. Because of this, and we've got a quote, Hitler transformed defeat into triumph. Now this would be our long-term success, wouldn't it? We know from the trial that Hitler became famous. He was given a platform and he delivered his speeches attacking the Weimar Republic and the Treaty of Versailles and all of it. Source D is really useful in showing us this because we know it as our own knowledge, but the content also shows us how important the Munich Putsch was for the Nazis. If it hadn't happened, he wouldn't have got this trial, he wouldn't have been given the platform. So keep that in mind. Then let's have a little look at the provenance of it. It says source D was written by an American journalist living in Germany in the 1930s. The book was not published until the 1960s. This perhaps that what he was writing was so sensitive that he feared publishing it in the 30s. So the 1930s is when the Nazis are in power with the Gestapo and the concentration camps and all of those things. So there's no way that this journalist would have been able to write these things in the 1930s. So although it's written many, many years later, what he's saying in the 1960s is probably the truth because he's got no fear. There's no one who's going to come knocking on his door in the middle of the night and taking him away to a camp. There's no Gestapo. So probably, realistically, what he's saying is true. All right. So possibly he could not acknowledge that this was a defeat. However, Shirer is actually positive about Hitler, commenting on his skill in transforming this defeat into triumph. As an American, safe and able to write freely 30 years later, we can arguably trust this account. All right. So hopefully you got a bit of an idea and you managed to pick out something similar to this. The own knowledge you should be looking at, the ballot not bullet, the trial. You should have things like that in your answer. So this is a good answer as it makes use of both the sources. We've got provenance in both of them. We've got some own knowledge in both of them. And we've picked out content from both of the sources. All right. So the failure of the putsch was not seen as important as the attention Hitler gained from it. But he wouldn't have got that attention and he wouldn't have got that platform in the court case if he hadn't have attempted to take over the country. So we've got to keep all that in mind. Remember, short and long-term causes. So this whole story, the Munich Putsch, is definitely one rooted in interpretations of whether you think it was successful or not. And the sources we've looked at hopefully give you a bit of a confidence boost, really, that actually we can do these sources, despite the fact that we do worry about them a little bit. If we know the story, then we can use the sources because the sources should just remind us about our own knowledge and what we do know. Okay, so that's this session done. A really important session, a turning point in our story. Following this, we'll have a little look at Stresemann from now. So we're going to leave the Nazi Party a little bit. Let's just, in our heads, remember that he's imprisoned. The Nazi Party are embarrassed. They've gone away. They're banned. And we enter Stresemann's Germany. It's called the Golden Years. So effectively what that means as we set this up is that Germany improves dramatically under Stresemann. And obviously when times are good, then there is no need for extreme parties. We've already talked about that earlier on in some of the earlier sessions. But when times are good, we don't need extreme left or extreme right. So the Nazi Party effectively, well, they just drift away into what we call the lean years of the Nazi Party. They go quiet, they go a little bit underground, but what they do is they reorganize themselves, ready like a snake, coiled and ready to pounce or strike as soon as they get an opportunity. And that is effectively what happens in 1929 with the Wall Street crash. That is the new Nazi Party's opportunity, and they do strike, and they do strike with a vengeance. Okay, so that's where we are. A reminder, as always, that all of these resources and videos and revision guides, they're all on stchistory.com, social media, and the YouTube channel. All right, thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next session.